everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Before I introduce each of you and what questions I'm going to ask of you, this is a panel of emerging scholars in teacher education who are here to discuss the interview videos that CTERIN has created of leading scholars or longtime scholars in teacher education. So each of our panelists here today have not only conducted some of these interviews, but they have viewed them, and they're going to share with us today some of their perspectives and thoughts about that work and how it pertains to their own work in teacher education. So let me introduce each of our panelists. Peter Bjorklund Jr. successfully defended his dissertation last month at UC San Diego. And that was about examining the formation of teacher identity from credential to classroom, focusing on the relationship between pre-service and early career teachers' teacher identity and social networks over time. Peter taught high school social studies for 7 years in the San Francisco Bay Area, and he's currently a postdoctoral researcher and lecturer at UC San Diego. Welcome, Peter. And Charley Brooks is a doctoral candidate in the education department at UC Santa Cruz. Her work is grounded in whiteness studies and critical language awareness to explore questions related to what types of history is taught and to whom. Charley was a middle and high school teacher in San Francisco where she taught world history and English. Welcome, Charley. And Alison Munzer successfully defended her dissertation this April at UCLA, which is about examining the use of cultural sustaining pedagogy in elementary school classrooms, focusing on what teachers do when translating theory into practice. Alison is also a former early elementary educator working in and around Los Angeles. She's currently an adjunct faculty member at Alder Graduate School of Education, leading courses on identity and teaching. So we have a spectacular panel in front of you. All of our candidates have been part of CTERIN's work for a while. They have all been part of our ETE Fellows group. And I'll just launch into some questions about the interviews you've conducted and watched. All right. We'll use these interviews as a starting point to grapple with and dive into issues that are central to your work currently and as you're thinking about your work in future. Dr. Brooks and Dr. Bjorklund, you will be moving into new areas as early faculty, and I'm sorry, Dr. Bjorklund, Dr. Munzer. Sorry, Charley, you were there. Charley, you're coming. You will be entering the field soon as early faculty. So what I want to first ask you all related to the interviews of our experienced scholars are, what themes unite these interviews for you? Anyone can step in and start us off.
I think something I noticed across interviews and then helped me reflect on my own teaching experience from the K-12 classroom to now in a PhD program is thinking about the shift from the technical or behaviorist models of teaching into the more sociocultural teaching as a social and political act. And it was interesting for me to hear the more experienced teacher educators talk about this, because I think I was in the classroom when this transition was happening. So I was part of sticker charts and card charts and a lot of behaviorist approaches to elementary school teaching and learning. And then when I went back to graduate school, the shift was happening. It was about culturally sustaining pedagogy. It was about sociocultural approaches. And so to be kind of there at the transition and then it helped me make sense of some of the changes that I was experiencing, but not necessarily naming for myself in that same way.
Yeah, I would agree. Others?
I definitely felt similarly, Alison. When I was starting teaching, it was contextualized by, a lot of these neoliberal reforms, like teacher pipelines coming from the university, like Teach for America. There was just a lot of energy around these various ed reforms, like extended learning time. And I feel like the discourse has really changed around what's valued and what's required to prepare teachers, and like what we should value with students. And you see it also with the changing views of assessments and schools kind of getting rid of the SAT, and actually taking steps to kind of change things on a structural level at various points in the education system, which is refreshing, I think.
I think something that links that for me was also talking kind of about the increased regulation or the deprofessionalization, continued deprofessionalization of teaching. And for both, I think, teacher educators and teachers themselves. And Charlie mentioning a lot of the kind of neoliberal reforms and the different pathways to teaching that really kind of minimize, in my opinion, kind of the work that teachers do. And I think something that really struck me, I believe it was Dr. Sleater talking about the need for like a public service campaign to kind of talk more about what teachers do. And this fascinates me because I haven't had space to do my work, but public opinion on teachers is something that really fascinates me. And I think there's recent Phi Delta Kappa stuff that talking about a lot of teachers. I was thinking it was from 2018. There's a Phi Delta Kappa, and the survey, they do a massive survey of public opinion around teachers and with teachers. And I think it was something like 55% of teachers said they wouldn't want their kids to go into the profession, right? Because of the lack of respect, because of the lack of pay, because of so many things. I think that I kind of echoed for me around all of these is that there's this kind of, and I think it's a lot of the work, and I did my interview with Dr. Zeichner, and so it was also kind of a lot of there's his work, this real tension in university-based education with public opinion about teachers, trust, which is something I am fascinated by and study, in the teaching profession, and these new pathways. They're all linked, I think, to kind of one of the main challenges that faces us as burgeoning teacher ed scholars and teacher educators.
Yeah, I'll agree. The things that I was thinking about as I was viewing the video too, and what you were just saying, Peter, the public awareness campaign, I've come to really understand during this latest budget cycle, is critical too for the role of higher education in the preparation of teachers. When we see what people's understandings are about teacher education, it's pretty shallow. And I think that I don't think that we've done a good enough job of communicating what it is we do as teacher educators. So on that note, I want to understand a little bit more about your own experiences and what opportunities you see as you enter the field of teacher education.
So I think I'll lead off because I think it taps into something else I thought was a major theme. So I can kind of tie two things together here. One theme that struck me throughout, and maybe this is because I do social network analysis and live relationships, but was the theme of relationships and lack thereof on all sorts of levels in teacher education. Being the community. I love the work that Dr. Zeichner does, thinking about like democratizing teacher education and community-based education. What relationship are teacher education programs having with the community? And then not only that, but what about within schools? Dr. Hollins spoke about her experience in a lab school where they knew the teachers that they were cooperative teachers knew the curriculum, they knew what was going on. And then to lead it back to the question about what opportunities do I see, I'm fascinated more right now currently by what is the real role of the peer relationships in teacher education programs. How are those relationships, what is actually happening in those relationships in teacher education programs? And something Dr. Tejas talked about with the idea of like cooperating in this pre-service teachers in the same classroom, right? So for me, my future work and things that kind of related to me was really, what are the roles of these relationships on all levels, but more specifically, what role are peers and playing in pre-service teacher programs in fostering teacher identity and in fostering kind of an understanding of what it means to be a teacher for new teachers? Because I think it's really interesting in terms of it's the relationships. In my own experience, it's different from, say, a relationship you maybe have in school. People come to these programs for a year, 2 years. What do they want to get out of those relationships? What do teacher educators want those relationships to look like? And what are those relationships doing to better the pedagogy in the classroom, and then also help them to understand relationships in their own classroom?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, Peter. Two things come to mind for me. One is, as a program director for many years, we told our teacher candidates, this is your cohort. These are going to be some of your friends for life. You're going to lean on them now. You're going to lean on them throughout your career. And so how does that actually shape identity is really interesting. The second thing is that you brought to mind for me was the loneliness of the teaching profession and the teacher in the classroom, and the model that we have had for so long with, the teacher on the stage by themselves in their own space. And I think you were alluding in your themes to this idea that we're rethinking staffing models in schools, and we should also be rethinking that and how we prepare teachers, as some of you were talking. So, Charley or Alison?
Yeah, I think I'm glad that Peter mentioned Dr. Tejas' interview, because he asked a really interesting question about, are our teacher ed programs sociocultural? Are we modeling the models that we're asking our students to then take into K-12 spaces? And it prompted me to think, like, okay, in my research, I think a lot about, like, what does culturally sustaining look like with 5 and 6-year-olds in early elementary school classrooms? But I have to go a further step to then think about, okay, well, what would that look like when I'm in a classroom teaching teachers who are getting their credential, or teachers who are working on their administrative credential once they've had more time in the classroom? And I think I've been lucky. I'm thinking about a TA experience I'm having with John Rogers and Megan Franke at UCLA this summer. It's for their Principal Leadership Institute, and it's a deep commitment to cooperative and collaborative learning that I think sometimes we don't often see in higher education. And like, we were just kind of slogging through Bourdieu last night and thinking about how, like, really giving teachers the time and the space to make sense of some of these, like, higher level, more theoretical scholars and theories, and not doing that, like, kind of traditional banking model thing where it's like, let me explain Bourdieu to you, or let me tell you, like, how this should look in your classroom, but really centering it on the teachers as knowledgeable and experienced educators who have their own value and perspective to bring. And I think that's been really nice for me to see, like, in action as a more of, like, a beginning, emerging scholar in this work.
Yeah, that's, gosh, you're making me think about so many things. The cooperation and the collaboration, what you're talking about in higher education and modeling, that's a key thing that we need to be thinking about as teacher educators, how we're doing this. And also for all of you scholars, doctoral education scholars, one of the things that is really challenging in teacher ed is the fact that we prepare all of our doctoral scholars for the environment that is very individual driven. It's supposed to be about your own research, your own publications, your own agenda, your own work. And how do we model and break out of that individualistic environment, reward structure that we've created in higher ed? Charley, what are your thoughts on your opportunities and experiences as you enter the field?
Yeah, I think for me, one of the things that really stood out from the interviews was Well, first, Dr. Hollins talked about entering the field of teaching during the civil rights movement. And so she was, the background of her entering into teaching was this fight for justice, but it was also met with culture of poverty arguments and a lot of deficit notions of kids of color. And so I think what stands out for me is this moving goalpost in terms of what constitutes social justice teaching and education, and how at different points in time it's looked different. And as Alison mentioned before, like the discourse even from 10 years ago has really changed in terms of what's required, and of teachers to interrogate their own positionalities and their own develop a critical consciousness. Those are all things that different scholars talked about in really different ways. And I found those divergences to be really interesting and really illustrative of like all the different possibilities that we as future teacher educators can glom onto in terms of community-based preparation programs like Ken Zeichner was talking about, or Anne-Marie Francoise was talking about, centering the work of scholars of color at UCLA with Center X and making that like the grounding point and the organizing principle of that work. And so that was really inspiring to me, especially because I'm developing a course for the social foundations class for the master's credential students that I'm going to be teaching in a couple weeks. And so hearing all of these different takes on it is really helpful in thinking, what's the history and the genealogy of these different ideas? How do I incorporate that historical understanding into a syllabus, but also center like the most groundbreaking new ideas that have come from that rest on the shoulders of all this other scholarship.
Something that really strikes me that listening to both of you talk, and I think about what I love something Dr. Francoise say, and this discussion she had is like, whose voice matters in these spaces, right? And it bring you back to relationships selfishly. But like, I think Alison, when you're talking about, what does it look like to be culture responsive with 5 and 6 year olds, and what does it look like in a teacher ed program? And it all boils down to kind of like, if not all boils down, goodness me, but it comes back to how do we have any kind of culturally relevant or sustainable without relationships, without centering the voices, as Charley was talking about, of different stakeholders, of a whole host of stakeholders. And I'm wondering, what then are we doing in teacher education to show that, to model that, right? What are we doing to say, look, these voices matter? And I think what Dr. Francois says is, I thought was so cool, was that when she was in early stages, it was really the voice of scholars matter. And then now it's the voice of teachers, but now it's really the voice of teachers. So whose voice matters in the teacher education programs? Whose voices are we centering? And how are we showing teachers then how to do that in their own classrooms? And how are we showing them how to foster those relationships that enable, because those don't come just around, that you have to work at those relationships. You have to build strong foundations with different communities, with different folks, to get those authentic voices. And I think that was just, as I listened to you and thinking about, I think that's an interesting way that we can have some kind of impact, is thinking through those things.
Absolutely. Other thoughts on this?
I think I'll just say another thing that Dr. Francois said was, teacher education needs to say who you are and what you want to be, and take on the question of what our role is in justice and helping to address injustices. And I think that just boils down the purpose of teaching in such a tight and clear way, where it's like, yeah, what are we doing? How, and it just speaks to the need for programs to really not be neutral and consider deeply where they stand on these really important issues.
Yeah, and I think that like kind of reminds me of a common theme that we saw across interviews, is that most of the scholars we talk to deeply believe that teaching, learning, and education is a perfect space to do some of this social justice work and this equity work. And that it's not inevitable, right? We have to be very specific about how, why, what, where, et cetera, we do that, but that this space is really can be ground zero for some of the things that we want to see changed or improved on larger levels across our society and our world.
It's clear you have been taking a lot of what you have been hearing from these experienced scholars, but now as you're taking your role in this profession, what are some of the things you're thinking about that needs to happen in teacher education?
One of the things that stood out to me from the interviews in response to your question, Tina, is that a lot of the people who have been situated in teacher education for a long time talked about these structural issues where there are supervisors who are really detached from what's happening in the academic parts of the teacher education, or you have professors who haven't done any work in teacher education, specifically teaching the methods classes for teacher education. And it seems like those are seemingly small things that actually have an outsized impact on the way that a program can or can't coalesce around certain values. And there's like these silos that exist within these programs, and they're very, from what it seems like, they're very contextual, like they're very dependent on that particular program. And one thing stood out to me from, I think, Kat Peck's talk. He talked about how there's very few studies that look across teacher education programs from a more macro level, and most of the research is about teacher educators studying their own practice in their own individual context. And so I think there's an opportunity there to really look at what's happening across states, and because it seems to be different in every state, and across, like within states and outside of state, across states, to just look and see what's happening and where these disjunctures and where the opportunities to kind of create something that's like just more cohesive.
That's a really good point, Charlie, and also bringing in. So let's focus on this research in teacher education area for just a minute. So you mentioned that a lot of what we're seeing in the research, as Dr. Peck mentioned, is teacher educators studying their own practice, a course that they're doing, or a program that they might be in charge of, and sharing that knowledge with others, as opposed to looking across programs. What else with respect to research should we be thinking about as future teacher educators, current and future teacher education scholars?
I think to Charlie's point, like teacher education research we often see situated at universities in teacher ed programs with pre-service teachers or very maybe early career teachers. And so thinking about how do we capture the fact that teacher education goes on forever, right? It's never really over, even after you're out of a credential or a master's program. And so how can is it through community-based initiatives where we develop relationships with schools or districts? And so we can, I think, pinpoint more about, mid-level, kind of those middle or longer term teachers and how they're making sense of whatever it is, the topic at hand. And I think it's certainly possible. It just doesn't have the same ease of access that I think sometimes people in teacher education programs get used to or maybe comfortable with. And I think also thinking about, I know teacher ed programs are becoming better at this in terms of ensuring that they're diversifying who they're recruiting and admitting into their programs, but then also like how can we ensure that we're doing that on the level of teacher educators, so the people who are working and teaching and researching in these programs, and then how can we also ensure that we're doing it with whatever research that we're conducting in the field. So thinking about how all of that is connected, and if it becomes a mission or a value or a goal of a program, that it needs to happen at every single kind of layer of that program.
Good point, Alison. There are so many layers to our work as teacher educators.
I really think that there needs to be kind of a value too in terms of how is our research giving back, right? Because so much of our research was publishable, but what is giving back? Where's are we designing our research so it's inherently, so that it is structured to help make and improve teacher education programs the way they want to. So that includes that collaboration between researcher, teacher education programs, being a teacher educator researcher. How are we collaborating with teacher ed programs to do the research that feeds right into their work, as well as can be disseminated to the larger public and for publication? But I think, I don't know, I think that needs to be a cornerstone of the research, is that it's always giving back in a way that's meaningful and helpful to teacher education programs and designed to do that.
Yeah, and each of you have brought up issues related to this piece, how it's giving back, the whose voice matters in the work, who's designing it, what is the work that you're choosing to do? Is it just based on your own individual interests, or is it actually what our stakeholders, and I'm talking children, families, communities, are saying we need to understand better? And then something all of you have brought up a couple of times is whose knowledge matters, and how are we organizing research across the different roles people have, people that we might consider the more practitioner roles, the teachers who know their practice well, trained researchers such as yourselves who know that area of work. I think we have seen a lot of traditional research we'll bring in practitioners to study, or we can talk about bringing in practitioners to help actually shape the work and design it, interpret it, and participate. Let's move to what else are you thinking about as you're moving into this profession that you think needs to happen in our field? I think about also in terms of moving the needle, so to speak, on some things that we think are essential that needs to happen.
I'll kind of take two things I'll kind of go across a few things, because I think one of the things that needs to happen, and it was, kind of brought up through the videos, was this diversification of teacher education, not only the teachers that we're recruiting and understanding the structural barriers, i.e., no pay, learning to teach for free, e.g., I guess I should say, but more diverse scholars more diverse teacher educators. But I was looking at, and Dr. Sleater mentioned the Thomas and Brown piece. And it's not enough to just say, oh, we're diversifying, but Thomas and Brown they have to also say, what's the purpose for diversifying? Well, they could talk about it in a school context, but I think if you think about it in teacher education, what's the purpose of diversifying teacher educators? How is it related to broader racial justice? What are the current experiences of pre-service teachers or teacher educators of color in this school? And then what will change at this school as a result? So I feel like we have to do more than just say diversify. So it's what questions are we asking ourselves as we do that? And that leads me to what I think kind of also, what can we do to move the needle on that? And this is related to some of my own work in sense of around belonging. But I think it's a valid question to begin asking teacher education programs, beginning to reflect on, what does it mean to belong here? What does it mean to be a part of this teacher education program as a pre-service teacher, as a teacher educator, and who gets left out of that? And what are the trade-offs? There's a piece that's talking about belonging in a different context by a scholar, Faf Sarnaka, and she talks about regimes of belonging, right? Which sounds counterintuitive, right? This idea of regimes are autocratic and belonging is warm and fuzzy. But it's kind of the idea of, what are the institutional patterns? What are the times and resources, commitments? What's involved? What's the price of belonging here? And I think by starting to examine that, because in my own work on that and looking at belonging in teacher education spaces, there's kind of not been a lot done there. So, and I think that ties into the issue of diversity and bringing in more voices, because really a sense of, if people feel like they belong in a place, there's an ideal state of being there, and they feel like they're valued, they feel like they're a part of something. And so what can we do to move the needle? Really beginning to investigate that. in our own programs, in the spaces we work. Who feels like they belong? Who feels like they're valued? And who's getting left out? And what does it even mean to begin to feel that sense of belonging across all levels of teacher education programs?
I think something I'd like to see kind of as we head into the future of teacher education is, and maybe this is just my personal experience at UCLA or something about the UCs more broadly, is can we take a more can we create a clearer pathway into teacher education for people who want to be teacher educators and researchers? And I think, at least for me, it was something that, oh yeah, I think I'm interested in this. And luckily I have a relationship with Anna Marie, and then I got connected with CTERIN, and now we're having this conversation. But it felt a little, again, personally haphazard. And I think, at least based on conversations with colleagues and peers, that it can sometimes feel that way in terms of how we get our own feet in the door to do some of this work. And I think part of that might be, and this is something that came up with Dr. Peck, and I think also with Dr. Zeichner, is that often at the research institution level, there's not a ton of respect or reward for tenure track professors who are interested in doing teacher education research or programming or supervisory work or data collection. So if we want, I think if we want to embody whose voices matter, whose knowledge, expertise, et cetera matter, then again, this all works in a collective way where it's the TEP educator and the people that they're educating, and then the students that are getting educated, and that kind of trickle down effect of how do we build systems or change systems in ways that seems to value and reward or respect this work, I think, in more systemic ways, so that it's not this side passion project or this thing that you kind of stumble into and you like it, so you keep doing it. It seems like then we're maybe not going to be able to achieve some of those more systemic changes or evolutions that we want to see if it continues kind of as this side project kind of thing.
I totally agree with that, Alison. And I wonder, just because of some of the comments that came up in the interviews, that oftentimes teacher education happens within university contexts in really small kind of, what's the word, boutique programs that don't serve a ton of people. And then the programs that are outside or a little bit removed from the academic tenure track world are producing and preparing the majority of teachers. And so I wonder how much of this question of wait, there's not really a lot of preparation that happens for teacher educators is tied to the fact that there's not a reward system built in for preparing teacher educators. And so it's kind of like these different paths that are taken. I don't think I'm explaining myself very clearly, but anyway.
I think you are, and that's going to be a particular challenge for all of you, particularly if you're in a research intensive environment like you've experienced in UC. You have seen firsthand sort of the differences between the professional mission of educator preparation and the research mission of these institutions. And I think, Alison, you mentioned if we can't, it's bringing me back to, I think, what you were saying at the very beginning, Peter, about public opinion or awareness campaign. If the faculty within your institutions are not understanding the need and value and work of teacher education, you're going to be pushing against a tide to be able to move the needle. So I'm heartened to hear what a good understanding all of you have around this particular issue, because I think you can take that with you and you can make some change there that needs to happen.
And I think it's an interesting comment too, because I believe it was Dr. Francois that talked about how are we collaborating in between departments? How is ethnic studies coming in and collaborating? So how, and bringing it back to these relationships forming within the teacher ed program, how are we relating to different faculty in the school and interacting and showing the work that's happening and creating a space where to bolster the reputation of the teacher education programs within the schools, so that, and bringing more people together in that creation?
A thought that's been coming up for me throughout this conversation is that that need for like a PR firm, right? Like public relations, and we have this, so often we talk about, well, the pandemic is a perfect moment to really like rethink or dismantle or whatever. But it feels like with the valuing of teachers first, we really do have this unique opportunity because kids have had to stay home with their parents or other caregivers or family members. And so I think, at least in my impression of it, is that I think there's been a natural newfound respect for teachers and for educators and for caregivers in general because of the way that our day-to-day lives have had to shift during the pandemic. And so it feels like, how do we take advantage of that kind of natural moment to then be really intentional and specific about how, yes, like there are teachers all over the country who spend 8 hours a day with 36-year-olds and it works. And that takes very specific training and commitment and passion and, some of the more nebulous, like esoteric things that I think teachers bring to the table. But that they're really professionals who are able to do significant and, measurable things with a lot of students in ways that I think, Finland, right, is the like go-to example of like the respect as a society that we have for people in this profession. So how can we be more intentional about that? Is that something that we need to explore in teacher education and the research and scholarship that we do? And then obviously like more respect for teachers, I think, then trickles up to increased valuing of teacher educators because all of these people and stakeholders are connected.
Mm-hmm.
And Alison, I think something that makes me jump out is, how do we get the PR going? Well, part of it is reaching out, going all the way back to reaching out to the community.
Right.
And are we interacting, engaging with the community? So the community, I think even by giving a voice to the community in the Zeichner model of things, that's how we're also going to bolster the image of teachers, because then people know what's happening, right? And there's a sense of like, oh, you value my voice, you're incorporating it. I trust you to do well by my students. I believe in you. I have this more of a stronger sense of the work that you do. So it almost goes back to, how do we do it? Engaging with the communities more strongly, from the get, right? From the teacher education programs, modeling that so that we know when we go into our classrooms how we're doing that.
Yeah, I think it definitely, that whole relational model of valuing, respecting what each kind of stakeholder is bringing to the table then sets this example of like, these are intentional and researched and, professionalized decisions that are rooted in research and practice and aren't just like people, I think, it's like, oh, well, they just love kids or they want the summer break. And that's like what we think about teachers sometimes in the very like broad stereotypical sense. And so like, if it can emanate from communities about the expertise and the professionalism that is at the heart of the work, I think that could be super powerful.
I think so too. Well, we're nearing the end of our time together, and there's a couple of themes that I'm hearing. I'm just writing down words as I hear you all talk that just seem so critical to moving the needle on the work that we need most in our profession and for the children ultimately that we serve. And that would be our students in school. And in the theme that all of you have brought up several times around how are we ensuring that as we're paying attention to what our children need most, it's about equity, it's about justice, it's about anti-racist pedagogy, it's about the power of diversity, it's about ensuring that everyone belongs and includes, and it included. So the words that kept coming up that you were using is relationship was one that was so important in so many different ways. And you talked about another one was modeling, that you all in your profession and us in our programs are modeling the kinds of things that we want to see happening for kids and for teachers and communities. Community was another one. Community-based was a big one, and how that root has to be a part of our work. Cooperation and collaboration, huge too in the things that you were saying. And part of that is knowledge and whose knowledge matters. And finally, we had a lot of this pertains to what you all are helping us at CTERIN really think about is what is the pathway to becoming a teacher educator that such as you all are doing here, and how do we navigate the structures of our university-based programs and university-based doctoral programs to create something very purposeful and create the right experiences for you all to grow your work and your practice and scholarship. So thank you for being here with us and sharing your thoughts. They were just spectacular. I'm so glad to see you all going into this field. And I just wanted to give you a minute, to say anything in closing about anything at all that came to you in this discussion or interviews that you watched.
Yeah, I think as we wrap up, what's nice for me to see, especially like as I'm finishing graduate school and going off into the world to work as a teacher educator, is that CTERIN was helpful for me clarifying like who I wanted to be as a teacher educator, and really feels like the seed of a start of like streamlining or making some of these pathways clearer for people who want to do this work. Mm-hmm. And that even though it felt kind of a little haphazard for me, that it's exciting to be a part of something where I think we'll get better and better at this work, about whether it's building pipelines or making some of the processes clearer for, newer and emerging scholars. So I'm grateful. And just to be back in community with all of you has felt really nice this morning. It's been too long.
This was a lot of fun, and it's exciting to have this space to think and really kind of digest all the amazing interviews that took place. They were so fun to watch and so fun to think about. And I'm definitely leaving this space energized and really, really stoked to keep doing the work. So thank you for that.
Me too. Thank you.
I agree. I think watching the interviews, it came through that all of these people, and you all also, are people who have really thought about questions of what the purpose of education is, and how can it be a tool for liberation. And there are lots of different ways to get at that. And so I leave this conversation with the idea in mind and the question in mind, like, who am I accountable to, and who are programs accountable to? And not just accountability, but also responsibility is a really important thing to consider. And it's really calming to know that there are all of these great people in teacher education who are really thinking deeply and have been for a long time about these questions also.
Yeah, I agree. And that reminds me of the one of the last words that you all brought up that I really love and sort of hitching to right now is belonging, and who belongs, and all of us belong here, and who doesn't feel that they belong, and how critical that is to guiding our work in the future. And yes, Peter, let's have this conversation again next year. Let's see where you all are. Find out. So thanks again, all of you. It's really, really interesting to talk with you and hear your thoughts.